Hey everybody, today we're going to be discussing the name Serug in Genesis chapter 11 and how it correlates to today's time period, and not necessarily this year, but within our time period where we started recording history. And he was born in 1819 AC, which means after creation. So what we're going to be discussing is 1819 AD and see if there's anything related to the definition of his name and see if there is something comparable in current history to past history. See if anything about taking root, branch, layer, twining, or interwoven can be found in history for 1819 AD. And the things that I found are Talmage's speech to Congress, the Annals of Congress, 15th Congress, 2nd session, the banking crisis of 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, and George Stokes. We're about to discuss how each of these are in relation to any of these definitions of Serug. Now, I remind you, Serug was born of Ru. And Ru, if you need a reminder, his name meant a friend, it meant a shepherd, a partner, and a companion. And Ru was the son of Peleg, whose name was overall meaning division. So let us go on and start our discussion. So we're going to start with Talmage's speech to Congress in 1819. So, the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Schopenhauer's PhD dissertation of 1813. The fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason examines what many philosophers have recognized as an innate tendency to assume that, in principle, the universe is a thoroughly understandable place. His dissertation, in effect, critically examines the disposition to assume that what is real is what is also rational. A century earlier, G.W. Leibniz, Leibniz, lived from 1646 to 1716, had famously defined the principle of this assumption, the principle of sufficient reason, in his Monadology in 1714, as that which requires us to acknowledge that there is no fact or truth which lacks a sufficient reason why it should be so, and not otherwise. The principle of sufficient reason might seem to be self-evident, but it yields surprising and curious results, according to this article. So, for example, we can appeal to this principle to argue that there can be no two individuals exactly alike, because there would otherwise be no sufficient reason why one of the individuals was in one place while the other individual was in another. Moreover, if the principle of sufficient reason's scope of applicability is assumed to be limitless, then there is a definite answer to the question: why is there something rather than nothing? Schopenhauer was keen to question the universal extension of the principle of sufficient reason, mainly owing to his advocacy of Kant's, Kant''S, view with that human rationality lacks the power to answer metaphysical questions, since our knowledge is limited to our specific and narrowly circumscribed capacities for organizing our field of sensation. So, right now, what I'm getting from this is sort of like, I believe the word interwoven is one of the definitions. And if you need to know what interwoven means, it means weave or become woven together or to blend closely. An example sentence: Wordsworth's political ideas are often interwoven with his philosophical and religious beliefs. That's a sentence that they used. So, yeah. And the reason I'm thinking that this probably goes with the word interwoven is because, well, the principle is sufficient reason. And they say that it might seem self-evident, but it yields surprising, curious results. And it gives an example that we can appeal to this principle to argue that there can be no two individuals exactly alike. And right now, it hasn't talked about blending them closely. So we gotta sort of read a little bit more into this to see where it's going with this. So Schopenhauer observed as an elementary condition that to employ the principle of sufficient reason, we must think about something in particular that stands in need of an explanation. And this indicated to him that at the root of our epistemological situation, or epistemological situation, however you wish to say it, we must assume the presence of a subject that thinks about some object to be explained. So from this, he concluded that the general root of the principle of sufficient reason is the distinction between subject and object that we must presuppose as a condition for the very enterprise of looking for explanations, and as a condition for knowledge in general. So you remember what the definition of interwoven was? It was to blend closely, to weave or become woven together. So if we read this again, it says, he concluded that the general root of principle of sufficient reason is the distinction between subject and object that we must presuppose as a condition for the very enterprise of looking for explanations, and as a condition for knowledge in general. I'm still seeing this interwoven here. We're looking for explanations, and this sufficient reason is the distinction between a subject and an object that we must presuppose as a condition for looking for an explanation to saying why the two are similar or why the two are different. But let's continue. Schopenhauer's claim that the subject-object distinction is the most general condition for human knowledge as its theoretical source in Kant's critique of pure reason. So Kant similarly grounded his own theory of knowledge upon a highly abstracted, formalized, and universalized subject-object distinction. Kant characterized the subjective pole of the distinction as the contentless, meaning lacking content, transcendental unity of self-consciousness, and the object pole as the contentless transcendental object that corresponds to the concept of an object in general. The general root of the principle of sufficient reason, as Schopenhauer characterizes it, is at the root of Kant's epistemology as well. So let's see. Following the demanding conceptions of knowledge typical of his time that had been inspired by René Descartes' quest for certainty, see Descartes' method of doubt and his famous cogito, Schopenhauer maintained that if any explanation is to be genuine, then whatever is explained cannot be thought to have arisen by accident, but must be regarded as having been necessary. Schopenhauer's investigation into the principle of sufficient reason can thus be alternatively characterized as an inquiry into the nature of the various kinds of necessary connection that can arise between different kinds of objects. Weave or become woven together, blend closely. Let's see if there's any other definitions for it. To become woven together, interlaced, intermingled, the act of interweaving or state of being interwoven. Is there anything else? Intermix, linked or locked closely together as by dovetailing. So there's a link here. So I want to also mention, if you just Google interwoven in 1819, it automatically brings up Talmage's speech to Congress. Automatically, if you just type in interwoven in 1819. I guarantee you, first thing that it came up on mine is Talmage's speech to Congress, 1819-Cengage Learning. It also brought up England in 1819, the politics of literary culture, and the case of ... So it's talking about an excerpt from England in 1819 there. There's also interwoven goes with transcript of McCulloch versus Maryland, which we'll get to in a moment. So interwoven, they are closely blended together. They're intertwined, locked closely together, linked. And Schopenhauer's investigation into the principle of sufficient reason can thus be alternatively characterized as an inquiry into the nature of the various kinds of necessary connection that can arise between different objects, like for a ball and a court or something like that. Interwoven. And I'm going to stop reading that one and go ahead and go on to the Annals of Congress. The 15th Congress, second session, led by Washington, and no, I think it's a note written by Washington and got from the Governmental Printing Office. So, when I had the honor to submit to this House the amendment now under consideration, I accompanied it with a declaration that it was intended to confine its operation to the newly acquired territory. Let's see. Newly acquired territory. I could sort of think of that as taking root, but I don't know. Let's see. Twining. What is twining? The bearing of twins, the occurrence of formation of twinned. Oh, I think it misdid my. Twine calls to wind or spiral around something. Grow so as to spiral around a support, to interlace. So it's just another way of saying interwoven. Let's see about layer. Layer, a sheet, quantity, or thickness of material, typically one of several, covering a surface or body. A person or thing that lays something. Arrange in a layer or layers. Propagate a plant as a layer. So it's like putting on layers. So let's continue. With a declaration that it was intended to confine its operation to the newly acquired territory across the Mississippi, and I then expressly declared that I would in no manner intermeddle, that's getting close, with the slave-holding states, nor attempt manumission in any one of the original states in the Union. Sir, I even went further and stated that I was aware of the delicacy of the subject, and that I had learned from Southern gentlemen the difficulties and the dangers of having free blacks intermingling with slaves. Connection, interwoven, twining, wrapping around, taking root. And on that account, with a view to the safety of the white population of the adjoining states, I would not even advocate the prohibition of slavery in the Alabama territory, because surrounded as it was by slaveholding states, and with only imaginary lines of division, the intercourse between slaves and free blacks could not be prevented, and a servile war might be the result. While we deprecate and mourn over the evil of slavery, humanity and good morals require us to wish its abolition under circumstances consistent with the safety of the white population. Willingly, therefore, will I submit to an evil which we cannot safely remedy. I admitted all that had been said of the danger of having free blacks visible to slaves, and therefore did not hesitate to pledge myself that I would neither advise nor attempt to coercive manumission. But, sir, all these reasons cease when we crossed the banks of the Mississippi, a newly acquired territory, never contemplated in the formation of our government, not included within the compromise or mutual pledge in the adoption of our Constitution, a new territory acquired by our common fund, and ought justly to be subject to our common legislation. So we're putting layer upon layer upon layer. It's becoming an interwoven United States. They added a new branch, a new state. So I'm going to leave that right there for now. Now this branch is pretty obvious. Banking crisis. Branch. Yeah, so the Panic of 1819 and the accompanying banking crisis of 1819 were economic crises in the United States of America, principally caused by the end of years of warfare between France and Great Britain. These two nations had been at war with each other since the 1680s. They finally settled their differences in 1815. While these two nations had warred with each other, the United States had prospered. These European nations needed American industrial and agricultural products to sustain themselves during the conflict. Once the war ended, American products were no longer in such great demand. Both the French and the British downsized their respective militaries. Many of these former soldiers returned home and assumed their peacetime occupations, cutting into the need for American items overseas. During the various British-French conflicts, United States goods, especially agriculture products, were in high demand in Europe. Americans had purchased Western land at an extravagant rate. In 1815, Americans purchased roughly 1 million acres of land from the federal government. In 1819, the amount of land had skyrocketed to 3.5 million acres. Many Americans could not afford to purchase the land outright. The federal government did allow Americans to buy the land on credit. As the economy ground to a halt in 1819, many Americans did not have the money to pay off their loans. The Bank of the United States, as well as state and private banks, began recalling loans, demanding immediate payment. The bank's actions resulted in the banking crisis of 1819 and helped lead to the Panic of 1819. The federal government tried to alleviate some of the suffering with the Land Act of 1820 and the Relief Act of 1821, but many farmers, Ohioans included, lost everything. And as a result of the Bank of the United States actions, money became scarce, making it even more difficult for people to pay their debts. Several states, including Maryland and Ohio, implemented taxes on the Bank of the United States. These states hoped that by taxing the banks, many would then enter the grasp of state governments. The state governments could then make loans to their citizens, thus relieving the money shortage. And in 1819, the case of McCulloch versus Maryland reached the United States Supreme Court. Maryland had created a tax on the Bank of the United States branch. And I lost my place. Okay, Maryland had created a tax on the Bank of the United States branch in Baltimore, Maryland. Although the federal government had the power to tax state and private banks, the federal government contended that states could not tax the Bank of the United States. The Supreme Court agreed with the federal government's position, contending that the federal government and its institutions were superior to the state governments. Chief Justice John Marshall believed that the power to tax is the power to destroy. In other words, if the states could tax the federal government, the states had the power to destroy the federal government. Ohio implemented its own tax against the Bank of the United States in 1819. In 1819, there were two branches. Two branches of the Bank of the United States in Ohio. One at Cincinnati and the other at Chillicothe. The tax law authorized the state of Ohio to seize $50,000 from each branch. And on September 17, 1819, the Ohio auditor Ralph Osborne authorized the seizure of $100,000 from the Chillicothe branch. The tax agents actually seized $120,000 from the bank. Osborne promptly returned the extra $20,000. The Bank of the United States sued Osborne for the return of the additional $100,000. The federal government contended that Osborne violated a court order prohibiting him from taxing the Bank of the United States. Osborne claimed that he was not properly served with the court order. The Federal Circuit Court ruled in favor of the Bank of the United States, and federal marshals immediately seized $98,000 from the Ohio Treasury. Osborne had paid his tax agents $2,000 for collecting the tax, and this money still remained in dispute. In 1824, the case reached the United States Supreme Court in Osborne v. Bank of the United States. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Bank of the United States. Ohio returned the $2,000 still in dispute. The Panic of 1819 and the banking crisis left many Ohioans destitute. Thousands of people lost their land due to their inability to pay their mortgages. United States factory owners also had a difficult time competing with earlier established factories in Europe. Many American people could not afford the factory's goods due to the lack of money in circulation. The United States did not fully recover from the banking crisis and the Panic of 1819 until the mid-1820s. These economic problems contributed immensely to the rise of President Andrew Jackson. Many Americans viewed Jackson as one of them. He argued against the Bank of the United States, a message many Americans and Ohioans wanted to hear. So the McCulloch versus Maryland case was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of the United States, and the state of Maryland had attempted to impede operation of a branch of the Second Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on all notes of banks not chartered in Maryland. Though the law, by its language, was generally applicable to all banks not chartered in Maryland, the Second Bank of the United States was the only out-of-state bank then existing in Maryland, and the law was recognized in the court's opinion as having specifically targeted the Bank of the United States. The court invoked the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which allowed the federal government to pass laws not expressly provided for in the Constitution's list of express powers, provided those laws are in useful furtherance of the express powers of Congress under the Constitution. This case established two important principles in constitutional law. First, the Constitution grants to Congress implied powers for implementing the Constitution's express powers in order to create a functional national government. Second, state action may not impede valid constitutional exercises of power by the federal government. So, the state can't make laws that will go against the Constitution, is basically what this landmark case did. Not only that, but it said that the Constitution granted Congress implied powers for implementing the Constitution's express powers. Sort of like what they do with laws of today. They feel the need to change something because it doesn't suit the way they see it's supposed to have said something. Like they have a differing of opinion of what the law actually says, so they're allowed to interpret it the way they want to interpret it, and is what I'm reading here, which is why we're kind of in the predicament with our Supreme Court today, with the 8 judges instead of 9, and how they interpret the law how they wish to interpret it, rather than what the Constitution actually states. Because when you say there's something implied, it's the same thing as saying it doesn't necessarily actually say it, but you're just going to say that it does because it's an implied thing. See, the state should have been allowed to put in taxes toward this bank if you were to take the Constitution straight at its word, rather than saying that there are implied powers by the Constitution. If there weren't implied powers, then that state could have legally taxed that bank. Not saying that I'm for or against taxes or anything like that, because I'd rather there not be this whole banking thing and whatnot. Just let everybody live freely together wherever and not have to deal with robbery and stuff, because everything's God's property anyway. He's the one allowing us to live on this land freely. But hey, they were taking root. They were establishing new branches. They were becoming interwoven, twined together. Everything was becoming established. In fact, there's a syllabus says Congress has power to incorporate a bank. That's interesting. Well, I'm going to skip this next part, see if there's anything later on. There we go. George Stokes, 1819 to 1903, was an Irish mathematician and physicist who made many contributions in the physical sciences. He studied fluorescence, Eric Weissen's world of physics, and the luminiferous ether, Eric Weissen's world of physics, questioning Young and Fresnel's ether drag, Eric Weissen's world of physics theory. He conceived ether as a viscous, elastic solid and concluded that there must be friction. Eric Wheaston's world of physics as the Earth, Eric Wheaston's world of astronomy, moves through it. Thus, a thin layer of ether, Eric Wheaston's world of physics, would be dragged along by the Earth, explaining the apparent lack of motion of the Earth with respect to the ether. Stokes systematically studied fluid mechanics, elastic solids, waves in elastic media, and diffraction. Eric Wheaston's world of physics. In fact, the basic equations of fluid mechanics are called the Navier or Navier-Stokes equations in his honor. He also formulated the three-dimensional analog of Green's theorem, known as Stokes' theorem, and was a pioneer in the use of divergent series. Paste. Divergent meaning increasing indefinitely as more of its terms are added, tending to be different or develop in different directions. Let's see if there's any others. Pertaining to or causing divergence, differing, deviating, having no finite limits. To me, whenever it says that they are diverging from each other, differing from each other, or from a standard, relating to, or being an infinite sequence that does not have a limit or infinite series, that's kind of like it has an infinite number of layers to me. Moving away from what is expected. Moving in opposite directions. Moving in opposite directions means like it's branching off. So, yeah. And George Stokes was the last one that I had found for this particular video. Because, to be honest, I could have probably done without George Stokes, but it did fit the bill of branching because he had come up with this theory of the divergent series. So, and it's within math and physics, so it kind of makes sense to include this. So next video we'll be discussing Nahor, who was born in 1849, and his name, and it could turn out to be a short or medium length video. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I feel like this video had it wasn't quite as eye-catching as some of the others, but it still gives you something to look at. You see, with the Talmadge speech, to Congress and how everything's talking about the nations being interwoven, and then you see the Annals Congress with the slaves talking to free slaves and all that, everything being connected. Even the banking crisis where they're branching off, and then its branch tries to sue in the McCulloch versus Maryland case. No, not the branch, the original branch, the federal branch, goes ahead and sues the breaking off branch as a state to give them the money that is owed, rather than uh, not giving them everything because they taxed the federal government. So everything's taking root here. Everything's like, this taking root here is sort of like leading to civil war, because like if you look when the Civil War happened, like just type in Civil War dates and it'll say 1861 to 1865. This is not that far off from those dates. This is getting set up for it, really. I mean, 1819, they're already discussing how some states are seeing a problem here where you have some free slaves and some not free slaves intermingling with each other. And Washington said he's not gonna do anything about this or something like that, because if he tries to make a law right then and there or something like that, he knows that it's gonna be a problem. He knows that this problem is going to eventually come and haunt him, or haunt the United States of America. He knows it's going to pit brother against brother, because you have some believing that it's a good thing and some believing that it's not a good thing. So it's sort of like, this is the root as to the root of the problem of the future civil war. Everything's starting to connect with each other, come together, take root. Problems here and there. Even having people suing each other because of these kind of interwoven problems. So it may have not been the most entertaining video, but it does make sense as to why this year is tied to the word interwoven. Or Serug, actually, is what it's tied to. The name Serug. So, as I said, next video we'll be discussing Nahor, and what was the year I said? It was 1849. So, something to look forward to. New lesson. And don't get me wrong, you're going to have boring videos sometimes, because sometimes it's just not information you really find very exciting and whatnot. Not everything's going to be as catchy as finding an actor that cursed the Jews or something, and you're not going to find those kind of events that are directly related to biblical events, biblical years, biblical definitions all the time. The purpose of these videos is for education anyway, not entertainment. It's for teaching you that the Bible's years, they're repetitive. They're reoccurring. Just think about that. Thank you for watching.